Okay, so lastly, in terms of exposure, it's very useful for me to show you in the camera the different tools that it has to help you when you are trying to set your exposure. So I'm going to turn my light back on. So we'll use the chart one more time. And I'm going to show you how I can use the built-in assistance functions to help set the exposure correctly on the camera. So if I stay in BT709 just for this demonstration, I'm just going to move across to my assistance functions. Now, the first three are in fact all to do with focusing and magnification, so we don't need to worry about those. In this particular instance, I'm only talking about exposure tools, and false color is the first of our exposure tools that we come to. Now, false color, if I turn this, hang on, let's turn it on HDMI so that you can see it. There we go. If I turn that on and set my exposure correctly, so let's go to 2.8 and this should be at 90. Oh, no, that's too much. Let's come back down. That's about right. Yeah, I think that's where we were before. So this is exposed correctly based on the numbers and the waveform monitor there. Obviously, the waveform monitor is doing this for me as well. But what you can see here is you can also see I'm using this false color. Now, if I look at the false color index, that will show you what these wonderful colors mean. We have red at the top and purple at the bottom. Those are showing you your white clipping and your black clipping. So in other words, if you say red or you see purple, then that is gone. That data is no longer there. It is an absence of data either at the top or the lower end. Your sweet spot, of course, is your 18% grey, and that is designated as green. So your subject should be somewhere around 18% grey, speaking obviously very generically here, and that's where this green comes in, and therefore it's no accident that we can see, as I shuffle my exposure around, you can see that the middle grey chip, which is the second chip down, the one underneath white, is the one that has green on it. This setting, so at F4, the green is only appearing on the right-hand side of the middle grey chip. That's because my key, my LED light here, is to the right of the chart, so it's obviously brighter on the right. We saw this before when we were talking about exposure. We can see the white chip is slanted for the same reason. This is just a colour manifestation of exactly the same phenomenon, but the right-hand side there is exposed correctly because it's an 18% grey chip or bar on that chart, and it's gone green, which, as that index shows us, should be 80% grey. So this is another way that we can expose. Now you'll notice that one stop over 18% grey is pink. If I come back out of there, and as I start to brighten this up, you'll see more of the image going pink. But even if I go back to F4, you can see over on the left-hand side there, there's actually a flesh tone reference there that's exactly middle grey, that's gone green. And then to the right of it, there's a white chip. And that white chip is actually, just by chance in this particular case, is now going pink. So that tells me that that white chip there is exactly one stop over middle grey. Your subject and one stop above your subject should be predominantly what you're seeing. So green and pink should be predominantly what you're seeing when you're in this false color mode. And then you just keep half an eye on the yellows and the blues, because the yellows and the blues are telling me the bits that are starting to be approaching too bright or too dark. So here we've got some purples there, we've got a tiny thin strip of red, which is on the specular reflection on the little highlight on the stand there. And as I brighten the image, that obviously gets worse, but the purple starts to disappear. And as I darken the image, we get more and more purple. You can see we're well underexposed there. So false color is just a really useful way of seeing the exposure of your image, but, and this is why I love it, it also shows you your lighting ratios. So with a glance, I'm not just seeing is my subject exposed, I'm also seeing how much brighter than my subject is the background or the foreground or the key side versus the fill side of my subject or whatever it might be. So this is why I find false color is just so useful to use. So that's false color. Let's turn that off and move across to zebra. Now, I'm going to turn my zebras on over the HDMI, but I do get a choice. There are two types of zebra, and I can choose to have one or the other on, or both. So Zebra 1, if I just flick to Zebra 1 for a second, Zebra 1, you can see underneath there, is a plus minus 5% selection. So I can choose anything I like. So for example, at the moment it's set to 75% plus or minus 5%. So my zebras, if I come back here, you can see there's some zebras appearing on the white chip at the top. and they're moving as I start to darken the image. So if I just go to there we go. So we can see that that right-hand side, as I'm looking at it, the right-hand side of the chart has got those zebras on. So that tells me that that part of my scene is at 75% IRE plus or minus 5%. If I go in and change that to, let's say, 90 and come out, you see that's disappeared. That's because it now no longer fits within that area. Now the difference between Zebra 1 and Zebra 2 then is that Zebra 2 is a specific value. Zebra 1 gives you a range, plus or minus 5%, so you have a 10% range around a given number, but Zebra 2 is a specific number. So if I set it to 90%, for example, and I brighten my image, as soon as I see zebras starting to appear on that 90% reflectance chip at the top there, which it is here, that tells me that that specific object where the lines are is now at 90 IRE. And it comes on at the moment that it touches 90 and it stays on above it. Whereas with Zebra 1, it will come on as it hits that 10% range. And if you travel through and out the other side of that 10% range, it then disappears again. So there's some very specific sort of behavior of Zebra 1 and Zebra 2 that are good for different scenarios. Zebra 1's great for when you're trying to expose a subject and you've got a key and a fill side and you want a range. And Zebra 2 is very good when you have a specific known value that you're trying to hit. As such, in this particular example where I'm using a chart to expose a scene, my amazing scene of light stands here, it makes sense for me to use Zebra 2, and I'm setting it to 90% because I'm in BT709 and that 90% chip should be at 90 IRE. If I was in YDR, then I could set my Zebra 2 to 75%, and then I would know when that white chip, that 90% reflectance chip, was at 75 and therefore exposed. Or I could set it at 60% if I was in log 3. You get my point. I can change that Zebra 2 to be very specifically a number that I know that a target reference lines up with, and then I can expose that way. If I come back in, I'm going to turn those zebras off. I'm going to move across to my waveform. Now, we've talked about the waveform briefly already. I always have the waveform on. I leave it permanently on, more or less, because I just find that is my main way of exposing and eyeballing the exposure of my scene. If I'm doing run and gun, I just got half an eye planted on that waveform monitor, normally in conjunction with the view assist, which I'll show in a second, which enables me to eyeball the screen and go, it kind of looks normal. But then in combination with the waveform monitor to actually see, you know, is it where I think it should be. So the waveform monitor, obviously we have that on at the moment. It's on over, I've turned it on over the HDMI, that's why you were able to see it. But let me just show you there are a couple of different functions. So I can choose between waveform monitor and vector scope, and in waveform, the settings for it allow me to change the position of it on the screen. So I can go from right to left. I tend to have it on the right. I can change it from a line type to line plus spot. And that little red box in the middle there, whatever that's on, it will show you on the waveform using a red color coding where that is sitting in terms of its exposure, which is very useful. I can do select line, which takes a very thin cut through the image and shows me where things are on that line. So if I tilt up and down, you can see that's now going more or less exactly through middle grey, but if I move it up, it's now going through the 90% reflectance chip at the top there. So I can take a very precise slice through my image and I can see where those values are falling, which works particularly well with the chart, I have to say. I've also got an RGB, which is essentially a parade by any other name. So that will show me the red, green and blue waveform, each different color channel stacked up side by side. Very useful for seeing if something is clipping in a particular channel, even though it might not be in terms of luminance. And then I've got my YPB-PR, which is showing me my luminance using the green channel and the blue difference and red difference alongside that. So let me go back to my line. I have a gain value here, so I can set it to a 2 times gain, so everything is doubled. Essentially what it does is the waveform doesn't change. What it's actually doing is it's just essentially zooming in on the bottom half of the waveform versus the whole waveform. So that's the difference there. But it's very good for expanding that lower half below middle grey and being able to see it in a bit more detail, where things are. So if you're trying to ascertain, for example, is my subject in the shadows visible and not disappearing into the noise floor, then that can be very, very useful. You can change our scale. So IRE would be 0 to 100, whereas obviously when we're in PQ, that's going to change. Now that will only apply for when I'm in HDR mode, but that will change it to, I believe it will go up to 10,000. I think that's right. Let me just double check that actually. Let's go into PQ. And yes, it is. It's 10,000. So when you're in that mode, you've got 0 is black, 100 obviously being our maximum value for SDR, but then we've got up to 10,000. So if you're shooting in HDR, it makes sense to use an HDR waveform, and that will automatically come on if you have that set on and you're in one of the PQ or HLG modes. I'm going to go back to IRE, and I'm also going to come back, and just so I don't forget later on that I'm in PQ, I'm going to go back into YDR. Now, I can also choose to have a vector scope up. So if I come out of the menu there, you can see I have a vector scope. And because I'm pointing at a chart that has chromaticity references on it, I can see those plotted on the vector scope. If I come into the vector scope settings, I can set my gain to 2 times. And I can get a good idea of whether or not my white balance is set correctly and my color matrix is doing what it should be doing, because I can see those primary and secondary references which are on, as we look at it, the right hand side, and obviously the desaturated references which are next to them. I can see those being plotted on my vector scope, and they're a little bit off. In fact, particularly my saturated red seems to be quite far off, which is interesting. In fact, I've just spotted exactly why this is off axis, and why in particular it's the reds and the yellows that seem to be off axis. I've just noticed, of course, I've got the R5C set to a preset 5600 Kelvin white balance. So that's why the vector scope isn't lining up perfectly. So if my theory is correct, if I set this manually to 6500 or thereabouts, and let's turn this color correction adjustment off. Yes, there we go. I can see yellow is now exactly where it should be, and although the saturated red still looks like it's slightly adrift, that's most likely because there's a tiny slither of daylight just coming in. There's about a 1-inch gap at the bottom of my blackout blind, just over there in that corner, and that's probably just causing that slight disparity there, but it's certainly a lot better than it was. Which brings me very neatly onto the importance of white balance, because if your white point is off, then your color matrix and how those colors are captured around the vector scope are all going to be off. And it's really simple, really, really simple. So I'm using the quick menus a lot here. You've probably seen me several times during this first chapter, just tapping on the bottom left corner of the screen. That brings on my sort of on-screen controls, which is a really nice feature of the R5C. The C70 does it as well, enables me to actually control an awful lot about the camera without having to go through all of the menus, which is nice. Where I find it very useful is particularly with this, what I'm about to do, which is all of the white balance settings. So yeah, there are preset white balance modes. So we've got a manual Kelvin here where we can dial in a specific Kelvin if we want to. Again, we can use the little arrows, or we can just drag and scroll. There's a color correction adjustment as well, which is essentially a green magenta tint, which I can use to pull out any kind of color cast that I might have identified with a light source, particularly things like sort of office overheads, which give off a kind of a limey green tint. Then I can push in a bit of a magenta color correction, a plus color correction to cancel that out. As well as customizing it when I'm in the Kelvin mode, I can also customize the presets. So we have 2 kind of presets here in terms of daylight and tungsten, and I can tweak those. So by default, the tungsten would be 3.2, and it probably wouldn't have, well, no, it definitely wouldn't have any color correction on it. So that would be my default tungsten preset, but I can tweak that preset if I want to, and it limits your range. So you'll notice that it tops out at 3.7 and it bottoms out at 2.7. So it's sort of updating the interface, allowing me to tweak slightly the preset tungsten or the preset daylight, which is kind of interesting. So if I put that back there, if I go to daylight, again, this is really useful because daylight often presets to 5600, but here in the UK, our average daylight noon color temperature is 6500 Kelvin. So more often than not in Northern Europe, where we are, much cooler than the typical daylight preset, which would be more akin to something that you'd find in Hollywood. So, for example, I might say, well, I will always want my daylight preset to be 6000 Kelvin because it's more likely to be more accurate for my surroundings, whatever it might be. I'm actually going to put that back to 56, having said that. Whatever it might be, it's kind of cool that you can tweak these presets. They're not just 5600 and get on with it. However, if you want to do it the best way, you should sample a neutral surface, a proper white balance target is best, obviously, and then assign it to either the A or B custom white balance presets. There's two, which is great. So you might choose to do one inside and one outside. If you're shooting a documentary and you're doing some interviews and then you're going to be shooting some B-roll, you can preset those and you can just sort of flick between them very quickly. But whatever you're doing with them, they are the only way where the camera is going to read the precise nature of the color tint of the light that's hitting your subject, measure that, and then reorient the color matrix around that new white point. And that is the correct way to white balance manually. Now, the camera here is pointing over at the color checker videos, so the large, extra large one. But I have here the normal sized one, if you like, the regular sized Calibrite color checker video target. So this is exactly the same thing on this side, but importantly, this regular sized one, standard sized one, has a white balance chart on the back, whereas the extra large one over there doesn't. In fact, let me turn my LED off. Now, because I'm in my color grading suite and the light bulbs and lights that we have here, some of which I've turned on just as a simple way for illuminating the scene here, they're 6500. So I've tuned my light panels, Gemini, to 6500, and I've set my camera to manually be 6500 for the white balance. So in theory, this grey chart, this white balance chart here, should be neutral. I'll find out when I do the post-production on this. But I'm only doing that because it's just for the the ease of it. This white balance chart can be used to set and assign this manual, this A or this B preset by simply filling the screen with it. So I'd have to bring the camera over to my scene, fill the scene as best as possible. You don't have to actually, but it's better if you do. Fill the whole frame with this, and then I'm just going to use the manual white balance button on the camera, and on the R5C, that's on the back, it's button 13. I can press that, it will blink and it will measure the light, and then it will come back with a reading. Now mine's flashing because obviously I've turned off the light over there and it's pointing at something that isn't relevant to setting white balance. But if I was doing that on the C70, the one that's pointed to me, it would blink and then it would say, yes, this is 6500 Kelvin. If there needs to be a color correction, it will adjust for that. So it will add in magenta or add in green to account for any kind of color correction. And it would display that value to me on the camera. That's obviously blinking now because, as I said, it's not getting a correct, an accurate result. So it's kind of the only way to definitively set your white balance with any camera, not least the R5C, is to use a proper white balance target. And as I say, fill the frame, press the manual white balance button. Now, on Canon's mirrorless cameras and DSLR's cameras, the way that you do that is by taking a photograph of that white balance chart and then setting that as the source of the custom white balance, which is fine but tedious. One of the huge benefits of the R5C is because we're in the video mode and it has a proper video menu, that allows me to properly have choices over the white balance. Of course, there's auto as well if I really wanted to do that. And set the manual white balance when I'm in these A or B modes using a dedicated button for it. And it's a one press operation, which, as trivial as that sounds, it was one of the best things about the R5C when I first started using it, the fact that I could quickly and manually set a custom white balance that way. So those are the various different ways that we can adjust that white balance using the touch interface, using the button 13 to quickly set that, and using the correct tools for the job, a proper white balance target. Of course, you can use a white piece of paper. Just bear in mind that they have pigments in them, and any surface with pigments in them is going to reflect those wavelengths of light that hit it. So the reflected light is then missing those wavelengths. In other words, the light that your camera is then white balancing from is missing information. So the best way, and fairly inexpensive way of doing it, is to get a proper white balance target to do that. So that's all of our main exposure assistance functions: our false color, our zebra, our waveform monitor. And we can use the combination of all of those assistance functions if we wish, one or two together. You might have a situation where you're checking the dynamic range of your scene and how you've lit the scene using the false color, and you might have that sending out to your HDMI to maybe an on-camera monitor. But then on the camera itself, you are relying on the waveform monitor to actually check your exposure. So you can use a combination. You can use one, you could use none, you could just eyeball it using the View Assist. And the View Assist is in exactly the same place. We actually touched on it briefly before. If I go to my monitoring setup, our View Assist is at the end there. Now it's grayed out at the moment because I'm in BT709. So the View Assist, its job is to show you what your log image would look like in BT709. So obviously it's grayed out right now. But as I showed you before when I briefly went into the View Assist, I can use this to essentially put a display LUT just on the LCD on the camera, just on the HDMI, just on the viewfinder, or all three, or a combination thereof. And it's a very useful way of having a sort of an eyeball confirmation that your image looks correct. So what I commonly do, my sort of normal workflow, is I would use things like false color whilst I'm lighting my scene and then turn it off once I'm actually rolling. If it's run and gun, I'd have my waveform monitor up pretty much all the time anyway. And then I would use my View Assist when I'm shooting log. So I've kind of got an eyeball confirmation that the image just kind of looks vaguely right. I find that's particularly useful when you're outside and you've got a brightly lit sort of daylight scene. Your log gamma is keeping everything contained, and your waveform monitor is going to confirm that for you. Whereas the View Assist, it might look like things are starting to clip. So it's good for kind of judging your subject looks normal and that it more or less looks like the image is exposed correctly, kind of that eyeball confirmation. But my waveform, I can kind of just quickly flick my eyes there and confirm that nothing's clipping if I don't want it to clip. Or it might be that I need things to clip in order to maintain exposure on my subject, which should always be my priority. So the combination of these assistance functions and everything that we've talked about in terms of how we can control the exposure of the R5C, they all come together to hopefully mean that when you're shooting with the R5C, you're getting the best results in terms of exposure every single time.